The court and the reigning family, said the emperor, was split into two parties. The one was that of the monarch, blindly governed by his favorite, the Prince of the Peace, who had constituted himself the real king. The other was that of the heir presumptive, headed by his preceptor, Esquires, who aspired to the government. These two parties were equally desirous of my support and made me the most flattering promises. I was no doubt determined to derive every possible advantage from their situation. The favorite, in order to continue in office as well as to shelter himself from the vengeance of the son in case of the father's death, offered me in the name of Charles IV to effect in concert the conquest of Portugal, reserving as an asylum for himself the sovereignty of Algarve. On the other hand, the Prince of the Asturias wrote to me privately without his father's knowledge, soliciting a wife of my choice and imploring my protection. I concluded an agreement with the former and returned no answer to the latter. My troops were already admitted into the peninsula when the son took advantage of a commotion to make his father abdicate and to reign in his place. It has been foolishly imputed to me that I took part in all these intrigues, but so far was I from having any knowledge of them that the last event in particular disconcerted all my projects with the father, in consequence of which my troops were already in the heart of Spain. The two parties were aware from that moment that I might and ought to be the arbiter between them. The dethroned monarch and the son had recourse to me, the one for the purpose of obtaining vengeance, and the other for the purpose of being recognized. They both hastened to plead their cause before me, and they were urged on by their respective counselors, those very persons who absolutely governed them, and who saw no means of preserving their own lives but by throwing themselves into my arms. The Prince of the Peace, who had been very nearly massacred, easily persuaded Charles IV and his queen to undertake the journey, as they had themselves been in danger of falling victims to the fury of the multitude. On his part, the preceptor Esquires, the real author of all the calamities of Spain, alarmed at seeing Charles IV protest against his abdication and in dread of the scaffold, unless his pupil triumphed, exerted every means to influence the young king. This canon, who had besides a very high opinion of his own talents, did not despair of making an impression on my decisions by his arguments and of inducing me to acknowledge Ferdinand, making me a tender on his own account of his services to govern altogether under my control as effectually as the Prince of the Peace could under the name of Charles IV. And it must be owned, said the emperor, that had I listened to several of his reasons and adopted some of his ideas, I should have been much better off. When I had them all assembled at Bayonne, I felt a confidence in my political system to which I never before had the presumption to aspire. I had not made my combinations, but I took advantage of the moment I here found the Gordian knot before me, and I cut it. I proposed to Charles IV and the Queen to resign the crown of Spain to me and to live quietly in France. They agreed, and I could say almost with joy, to the proposal. So inveterately were they exasperated against the son, and so earnestly did they in their favorite wish to enjoy for the future tranquility and safety. The Prince of the Asturias made no extraordinary resistance to the plan, but neither violence nor threats were employed against him, and if he was influenced by fear, which I'm very willing to believe, that could only be his concern. There you have, in very few words, a complete historical sketch of the affair in Spain. Whatever may be said or written on it must account to that, and you see that there could be no occasion for me to have had recourse to paltry tricks, to falsehoods, to breaches of faith, or violation of engagements. In order to establish my guilt, it would have been necessary to show my inclination to degrade myself gratuitously, but of that propensity I have never given an instance. As to the rest, the instant of my decision was known. The crowd of intriguers that swarm in every court, and even those among them who had been the most active in producing the misfortunes of the country, endeavored to get into favor with Joseph, as they had done with Charles IV. and Ferdinand VII, they watched with extraordinary diligence the progress of events and changed sides at a later period in proportion as difficulties increased and our disasters came on. They pursued the plan so successfully that they are the persons who at this moment govern Ferdinand. And what is truly horrible, the better to secure their influence, they did not hesitate to impute whatever was odious and criminal in past calamities to the mass of simpletons whom they proscribed and banished, of those men naturally well disposed and who, in principle, decidedly blamed Ferdinand's journey. Of this latter class, several who opposed the journey afterwards took the oath of allegiance to Joseph, who seemed then to be identified with the happiness and tranquility of their country, and continued faithful to him until the grand catastrophe that drove him from the throne. It would be difficult to accumulate a greater mass of impudence and baseness than that exhibited by all those intriguers, the principal performers in that grand scene. The extenuates, one may fairly remark, the degradation to which similar acts of violence have reduced France. In the eyes of Europe, it is evident that they do not belong to her exclusively. Intriguing, ambitious, rapacious men are everywhere to be found and are everywhere the same. Individuals alone are guilty. Nations cannot incur the responsibility. Their only disadvantage arises from their being forced to witness these misdeeds. Unhappy the country, which becomes the scene of them. At present, the affair of Spain is perfectly known thanks to the writings of the principal actors, the Canon Esquarquis, the Minister Sevallius, and others, but above all, to those of the worthy and respectable Monsieur Laurent, who, under the anagrammatic signature of Nierto, has published the memoirs of that time, sanctioned by all the official documents, the opposite contradictions of the two first, their mutual disputes, assertions, and denials of their contemporaries, have reduced their writings to their real value by stripping them of whatever was erroneous, false, or even fabricated. The result is that, in the opinion of a very cool and impartial judge, they all concur, even involuntarily, in confirming the justificatory assertions advanced by Napoleon, not that they do not produce that difference which inevitably arises from the diversity of party interest, but solely because neither of them actually establishes the grounds of positive crimination, nor furnishes any official document by which it can be proved, while all those which exist attest and sanction the contrary. It may also be remarked in the history of those transactions which must now be considered as genuine, that England herself was altogether a stranger to them, at least with respect to their origin, a fact which was far from Napoleon's way of thinking, who charged the English at the time with being the first cause of all the intrigues, and who still persevered in the accusation at St. Helena. So habituated was he to discover them at the bottom of every plot which was forming against him. With respect to this affair of Spain, I have further to notice a letter from the Emperor which throws more light upon the subject than volumes. It is admirable, and the events which followed stamp it as a masterpiece. It exhibits the rapidity, the eagle-eyed view which Napoleon formed his opinion of things and men. Unfortunately, it also shows how much the execution of the inferiors employed during the greater part of the time destroyed the finest and most exalted conceptions. And in that point of view, this letter remains a very precious document for history. It becomes prophetic by its date, 29th of March, 1808. Monsieur le Grand Duc de Berg, I am afraid lest you should deceive me with respect to the situation of Spain, and lest you should also deceive yourself. Events have been singularly complicated by the transaction of the 20th of March. I find myself very much perplexed. Do not believe that you are about to attack a disarmed nation, and that you can, by a mere parade of your troops, effect the subjugation of Spain. The revolution of the 20th of March proves that the Spaniards possess the energy you have to contend with the new people. It has all the courage and will display all the enthusiasm shown by men who are not worn out by political passions. The aristocracy and the clergy are the masters of Spain. If their privileges and existence be threatened, they will bring into the field against us levies en masse that may perpetuate the war. I'm not without my partisans, but if I show myself as a conqueror, they will abandon me. The Prince of the Peace is detested because he's accused of having betrayed Spain to France. This is the grievance which has assisted Ferdinand's usurpation. The popular is the weakest party. The Prince of the Asturias does not possess a single quality requisite for the head of a nation. That will not prevent his being ranked as a hero in order that he may be opposed to us. I will have no violence employed against the personages of this family. It can never answer any purpose to excite hatred and inflame animosity. Spain has 100,000 men under arms, more than are necessary to carry on an internal war. With advantage scattered over several parts of the country, they may serve as rallying points for a total insurrection of the monarchy. I lay before you all the obstacles which must inevitably happen. There are others of which you must be aware. England will not allow the opportunity to escape her without multiplying our embarrassments. She daily sends packet boats to the forces which she maintains on the coast of Portugal and in the Mediterranean, and she enlists into her services Sicilians and Portuguese. The royal family not having left Spain for the purpose of establishing itself in its American colonies. The state of the country can be changed only by a revolution. It is perhaps of all others in Europe that which is the least prepared for one. Those who witness the monstrous defects of that government and the anarchy which has been substituted for the legitimate authority are the fewest in number. Those defects in that anarchy are converted to their own advantage by the greatest number. I can, consistently with the interests of my empire, do a great deal of good in Spain. What are the best means to be adopted? Shall I go to Madrid? Shall I take upon myself the office of Grand Protector in deciding between the father and the son? It seems to me a matter of difficulty to support Charles IV on the throne. His government and his favorite is so very unpopular that they could not maintain themselves for 3 months. Ferdinand is the enemy of France, and to that consideration he has been indebted for the crown. His elevation to the throne would be favorable to the factions, which for 25 years have longed for the destruction of France. A family alliance would be but a slender tie. Queen Elizabeth and other French princesses perished miserably whenever they could be immolated with impunity to the atrocious spirit of vengeance. My opinion is that nothing should be hurried on, and that our measures ought to be regulated by events as they occur. It will be necessary to strengthen the bodies of troops which are to be stationed on the frontiers of Portugal and wait. I do not approve of your Imperial Highness's conduct in so precipitately making yourself master of Madrid. The army ought to have been kept 10 leagues from the capital. You had no assurance that the people and the magistracy were about to recognize Ferdinand without a struggle. The Prince of the Peace must, of course, have partisans among those employed in the public service. There is also a habitual attachment to the old king, which might lead to unpleasant consequences. Your entrance into Madrid by alarming the Spaniards has powerfully assisted Ferdinand. I have ordered Savary to attend the new king and observe what passes. He will concert matters with your Imperial Highness. I shall hereafter decide upon the measures necessary to be pursued. In the meantime, I think it proper to prescribe the following line of conduct to you. You will not pledge me to an interview in Spain with Ferdinand unless you consider the state of things to be such that I ought to recognize him King of Spain. You will behave with attention and respect to the king, the queen, and the Prince Godoy. You will require for them and pay them the same honors as formerly. You will manage matters so as to prevent the Spaniards from entertaining any suspicion of the course I shall pursue. You will find no difficulty in this, as I know nothing about it myself. You will make the nobility and clergy understand that if the interference of Spain be requisite in the affairs of Spain, their privileges and immunities shall be respected. You will assure them that the emperor wishes for the improvement of the political institutions of Spain in order to place her in a relative state to that of civilized Europe and to free her from the administration of favoritism. You will tell the magistrates and the inhabitants of the towns and the enlightened classes that Spain stands in need of having the machine of her government reorganized of a system of laws calculated for the protection of the people against the tyranny and usurpations of feudality, and of establishments which may revive industry, agriculture, and the arts. You will describe to them the state of tranquility and ease enjoyed by France, notwithstanding the wars in which he has been constantly involved, and the splendor of religion which owes its existence to the concordat I have signed with the Pope. You will explain to them the advantages that they may derive from political regeneration, order, and peace at home, respect and influence abroad. Such should be the spirit of your conversation and your writings. Do not hazard anything hastily. I can wait at Bayonne. I can cross the Pyrenees, and strengthening myself towards Portugal, I can go and carry on the war in that quarter. I shall take care of your particular interests. Do not think of them yourself. Portugal will be at my disposal. Let no powerful object engage you and influence your conduct. That would be injurious to me and would be still more hurtful to yourself. You are too hasty in your instructions of the 14th. The march you order General Dupont to take is too rapid on account of the event of the 19th of March. They must be altered. You will make new arrangements. You will receive instructions from my Minister for Foreign Affairs. I enjoin the strictest maintenance of discipline. The slightest fault must not go unpunished. The inhabitants must be treated with the greatest attention. Above all, the churches and convents must be respected. The army must avoid all misunderstandings with the body and detachment of the Spanish army. A single flash in the pan must not take place on either side. Let Solano march beyond Badajoz, but watch his movements. Do you yourself trace out the marches of my army, that it may be always kept at a distance of several leagues from the Spanish corps. Should hostilities take place, all would be lost. The fate of Spain can alone be decided by political views and by negotiation. I charge you to avoid all explanation with Solano as well as with the other Spanish generals and governors. You will send me two expresses daily in case of events of superior interest. You will dispatch officers of ordnance. You will immediately send back the Chamberlain of Tea, the bearer of this dispatch, and give him a detailed report. Napoleon. June 15th. The weather was superb. We took an airing in our calash and observed very near the shore a large vessel which seemed to maneuver in a singular manner. We took it by its appearance for the Newcastle, which had been for some time expected to relieve the Northumberland, but it was only one of the company's ships. During part of the day, the Emperor, after running over a great number of topics, came at length to mention several persons who, were they at liberty, he said, would join him at St. Helena, and he undertook to explain the motives by which they might be influenced. From this subject, he was led to touch upon the motives of those who were about him. Bertram, he said, is henceforth identified with my fate. It is a historical fact. Gourgaud was my first officer of ordnance. He is my own work. He is my child. Montslon is Semonville's son, a brother-in-law to Joubert, a child of the Revolution and of camps. But you, my good friend, said he to the fourth, you, and after a moment's thought he resumed, you, my good friend, let us know by what extraordinary chance you find yourself here. The answer was, sire, by the influence of my happy stars and for the honor of the emigrants. June 16th, the weather was completely fine. The Emperor entered my apartment about 10 o'clock. I was employed in dressing myself and also in dictating my journal to my son. The Emperor cast his eye over it for a few seconds and said nothing. He left it to look at some drawings. They were topographical sketches executed with a pen of some of the fields of battle in Italy. They were planned by my son, and we felt pleasure in reserving them as an agreeable surprise for the Emperor. We had until then been employed upon them in secret. I followed the Emperor to the garden. He talked a great deal in the articles that had been just sent to us from England, and which chiefly consisted of furniture. He exposed the ill grace and awkwardness of those who had been employed to deliver them to us. He observed that in presenting even what would have been most agreeable to us, they found the means of hurting our feelings. He was on that account determined not to make use of them, and he declined accepting two fowling pieces which were particularly intended for him. The Emperor breakfasted in the open air, and we were all invited to his table. The conversation turning on fashions and dress, the Emperor said that at one period he had resolved to prohibit the use of cotton in France for the more effectual encouragement of the lawn and cambric trade of our towns in Flanders. The Empress Josephine was shocked at the idea, which she decidedly opposed. and it was given up. The emperor was in a happy humor for conversation, and the weather was very mild and tolerably pleasant. He began walking in the kind of alley which is perpendicular to the front of the house. The conversation turned on the celebrated epic of Tilsit. And the following are the interesting particulars which I collected. The emperor remarked that had the Queen of Prussia arrived at the commencement of the negotiations, she might have exercised considerable influence with respect to the result. Happily, she arrived when they were sufficiently advanced to enable the emperor to decide upon their conclusion. 24 hours afterwards, the king, it was thought, had prevented her early appearance in consequence of a rising jealousy against a great personage, which was confidently stated, said the emperor, not to have been destitute of some slight ground. The moment of her arrival, the emperor paid her a visit. The Queen of Prussia said he had been very beautiful, but she was beginning to lose some of the charms of her youth. The emperor declared that the queen received him like Mademoiselle Duchesnois in the character of Chimon, thrown back into a grand attitude, demanding, calling aloud for justice. In one word, it was altogether a theatrical scene. The representation was truly tragic. He was unable to speak for an instant and thought the only way of extricating himself was that of bringing back the business to the tone of regular comedy, which he attempted by presenting her with a chair and gently forcing her to be seated. She did not, however, discontinue the most pathetic expressions. Prussia, she exclaimed, had been blindfolded with respect to her power. She had dared to contend with a hero, to oppose herself to the destinies of France, to neglect his auspicious friendship. She was deservedly punished for it. The glory of the great Frederick, his memory, and his inheritance had puffed up the pride of Prussia, and had caused her ruin. Etc., etc. She solicited, supplicated, implored. Magdeburg, in particular, was the object of her efforts and wishes. The emperor kept his ground as well as he could. Fortunately, the husband made his appearance. The queen reproved with an expressive look the unseasonable interruption and showed some pettishness. In fact, the king attempted to take part in the conversation, spoiled the whole affair, and I was, said the emperor, set at liberty. The emperor entertained the queen at dinner. She played off, said she, all her wit against me. She had a great deal. All her manners, which were very fascinating, all her coquetry. She was not without charms. But I was determined not to yield. I found it necessary, however, to keep a great command over myself, that I might continue exempt from all kinds of engagement and every expression which might be taken in a doubtful sense. And the more so because I was carefully watched, and peculiarly by Alexander. An instant before dinner, Napoleon took a very beautiful rose from a flower stand, which he presented to the queen. She had first expressed by the motion of her hand a kind of prepared refusal, but suddenly recollecting herself, she said, "Yes, but at least with Magdeburg." The emperor replied, "But I shall observe to your majesty that it is I who present and you who are about to receive it." The dinner and the remainder of the time passed over in that manner. The queen was seated at table between the two emperors, who rivaled each other in gallantry. She was placed near Alexander's best ear, with one he could scarcely hear. The evening came, and the queen having retired, the emperor, who had shown the most engaging attentions to his guest, but who had at the same time been often driven to an extremity, resolved to come to a point. He sent for M. de Talleyrand and Prince Curican, talked big to them, and letting fly, continued he some harsh words, observed that after all, a woman and a piece of gallantry ought not to alter system conceived for the destiny of a great people. And then he insisted upon the immediate conclusion of the negotiations and the signing of the treaty, which took place according to his orders. Thus, said he, the Queen of Prussia's conversation advanced the treaty by a week or a fortnight. The queen was preparing to renew her attacks the next day, and was indignant when she heard that the treaty was signed. She wept a great deal, and determined to see the Emperor Napoleon no more. She would not accept a second invitation to dinner. Alexander was himself obliged to prevail upon her. She complained most bitterly and maintained that Napoleon had broken his word, but Alexander had been always present. He had even been a dangerous witness, ready to give evidence of the slightest action or word on the part of Napoleon in her favor. He has made you no promise, was his observation to her. If you can prove the contrary, I here pledge myself as between man and man to make him keep his promise, and he will do so, I'm convinced. But he has given me to understand, said she. No, replied Alexander, and you have nothing to reproach him with. She came at length. Napoleon, who had no longer any occasion to be on his guard against her, redoubled his attention. She played off for a few moments the airs of an offended coquette, and when the dinner was over and she was about to retire, Napoleon presented his hand and conducted her to the middle of the staircase, where he stopped. She squeezed his hand and said with a kind of tenderness, "Is it possible that after having had the honor of being so near to the hero of the century and of history, he will not leave me the power and satisfaction of being enabled to assure him that he is attached to him for life?" "Madame," replied the emperor in a serious tone, "I am to be pitied. It is the result of my unhappy stars." He then took leave of her. When she reached her carriage, she threw herself into it in tears, sent for Duroc, whom she highly esteemed, renewed all of her complaints to him, and said, pointing to the palace, "There is a place in which I have been cruelly deceived." The Queen of Prussia said the emperor was unquestionably gifted with many happy resources. She possessed a great deal of information and had many excellent capabilities. It was she who really reigned for more than 15 years. She also, in spite of my dexterity and all my exertions, took the lead in conversation and constantly maintained the ascendancy. She touched perhaps too often upon her favorite topic, but she did so, however, with the greatest plausibility and without giving the slightest cause of uneasiness. It must be confessed that she had an important object in view, and that the time was short and precious. One of the high contracting parties said the emperor had frequently assured her that she ought to have come in the beginning or not at all, and observed that for his part he had done everything in his power to induce her to come at once. It was suspected, continued the emperor, that he had personal motive to gratify by her coming. But on the other hand, the husband had a motive equally personal in opposing it. Napoleon believed him to have been very kind and a sincere friend in the business. The King of Prussia said the emperor had requested his audience of leave on that very day, but I postponed it for 24 hours at the secret entreaty of Alexander. The King of Prussia never forgave me for putting off that audience. So clearly did it seem to him that Royal Majesty was insulted by my refusal. Another heavy charge against me, and of which he has never been able to divest his feelings, was that of having violated, as he said, his territory of Ansbach in our campaign of Austerlitz and all his subsequent interviews. However important the subject of our discussion, he laid them all aside for the purpose of proving that I had really violated his territory of Ansbach. He was wrong, but in short, it was his conviction, and his resentment was that of an honest man. His wife, however, was vexed at it and wished him to pursue a higher system of politics. Napoleon reproached himself with the real fault in allowing the King of Prussia's presence at Tilsit. His first determination was to prevent his coming. He would then have been less bound to show any attention to his interests. He might have kept Silesia. He might have aggrandized Saxony with it, and have probably reserved for himself another kind of destiny. He further remarked, "I learn that the politicians of the present day find great fault with my Treaty of Tilsit. They have discovered that I had by that means placed Europe at the mercy of the Russians. But if I had succeeded at Moscow, and it is now known how very near I was, they would no doubt have admired us for having, on the contrary, by that treaty placed the Russians at the mercy of Europe. I entertained great designs with respect to the Germans, but I failed, and therefore I was wrong. This is according to every rule of justice." Almost every day at Tilsit, the two emperors and the king rode out on horseback together, but said Napoleon, the latter was always awkward and unlucky. The Prussians felt it very visibly. Napoleon was constantly between the two sovereigns, but either the king fell behind or jostled and incommoded Napoleon. He showed the same awkwardness. On their return, the two emperors dismounted in an instant and took each other by the hand to go up the stairs together. But as the honors were done by Napoleon, he could not enter without first seeing the king pass. It was sometimes necessary to wait for him a long time, And as the weather was often rainy, it happened that the two emperors got wet on the king's account, to the great dissatisfaction of all the spectators. This awkwardness, said the emperor, was the more glaring as Alexander is in a position of all the graces and equal in elegance of manners to the most polished and amiable ornaments of our Parisian drawing rooms. The latter was at times so tired of his companion, who seemed lost in his own sorrows or in some other cause, that we mutually agreed on breaking up our common meeting to get rid of him. We separated immediately after dinner under the pretense of some particular business, but Alexander and I met shortly afterwards to take tea with one another, and we then continued in conversation until midnight and even beyond it. Alexander and Napoleon met again sometime after Erfurt and exchanged the most striking testimonies of affection. Alexander expressed with earnestness the sentiments of tender friendship and real admiration which he entertained for Napoleon. They passed some days together in the enjoyment of the charms of perfect intimacy and of the most familiar communications of private life. We were, said the emperor, two young men of quality who, in their common pleasures, had no secret from each other. Napoleon had sent for the most distinguished performers of the French theater. Celebrated actress Mademoiselle B attracted the attention of his guest, who had a momentary fancy to get acquainted with her. He asked his companion whether any inconvenience was likely to be the result. None, answered the latter. Only, added he intentionally, it is a certain and rapid mode of making yourself known to all Paris. After tomorrow post-day, the most minute details will be dispatched, and in a short time, not a statuary at Paris will be qualified to give a model of your person from head to foot. The danger of such a kind of publicity appeased the monarch's rising passion. For, observed Napoleon, he was very circumspect with regard to that point, and he recollected, no doubt, the old adage, when the mask falls, the hero disappears. The emperor assured us that had it been his wish, Alexander would certainly have given him his sister in marriage. His politics would have dictated the match, even had his inclination been against it. He was petrified when he heard of the marriage with Austria and exclaimed, "This consigns me to my native forests." If he seemed at first to shift about, it was because some time was necessary to enable him to come to a decision. His sister was very young, and the consent of his mother was requisite. This was settled by Paul's will, and the Empress Mother was one of Napoleon's greatest enemies. She was also the dupe of all the absurdities, all the ridiculous stories which had been circulated on his personal account. "How," she exclaimed, "can I marry my daughter to a man who is unfit to be anyone's husband? Shall another man take possession of my daughter's bed, if it be necessary that she should have children? She is not formed for such a fate." "Mother," said Alexander, "can you be so credulous as to believe the calumnies of London and the insinuations of the saloons of Paris? If that be the only difficulty, if it be that alone which gives you pain, I answer for him, and many others have it in their power to answer for him with me." If Alexander's affection for me was sincere, said the emperor, it was alienated from me by the force of intrigue. Certain persons, M or others, at the instigation of T, lost no seasonable opportunity of mentioning instances of my turning him into ridicule, and they assured him that at Tilsit and Erfurt he no sooner turned his back than I took my opportunity of laughing at his expense. Alexander is very susceptible, and they must have easily soured his mind. It is certain that he made bitter complaints of it at Vienna during the Congress, and yet nothing was more false. He pleased me, and I loved him. As one of Napoleon's aides de camp was sent immediately after the Treaty of Tilsit to Alexander at Petersburg and was loaded with favors. The efforts and liberality of Alexander were inexhaustible to render himself agreeable to his new ally. A circumstance of 1814 is related, which drew, it is said, from S, a very happy allusion to his mission in Russia. S was, on his return from Russia, appointed minister of the police at Paris. A short time after the Restoration, Monsieur de B, addressing him at the Tuileries in a manner altogether careless and reserved, said, "Now that all is over, you may tell us everything. Pray, who was your agent at Hartwell?" This was, as everyone knows, the residence of Louis XVIII in England. As astonished at the want of good sense evinced by Monsieur de B, answered with dignity, "Monsieur le Comte, the Emperor considered the asylum of kings as an inviolable sanctuary, and it was a principle which he, impressed upon his police, and we adhered to it. We have since learned that the same conduct was not observed with respect to him, but you, sir, should entertain less doubt upon the subject than any other person. When I arrived at Petersburg, you were there on the part of the king. The Emperor Alexander, in the first warmth of his reconciliation, acquainted me with everything that respected you and asked me whether it was the wish of my government that you should be ordered to leave his dominions. I had received no instructions upon that head. I wrote for them to the emperor. His answer was, by returned a courier, that he was satisfied with the sincere friendship of Alexander, that he would never interfere in his private arrangements, that he entertained no personal hatred against the Bourbons, and that if he believed it were possible for them to accept it, he would offer them an asylum in France and any royal residence which might be agreeable to them. If you were then ignorant of these instructions, you will no doubt find them among the papers of the Foreign Office.